So just to set the context a little bit and think about the international situation, around the world, about 90% of ILO countries have some form of minimum wage legislation that may either be in the form of a national minimum wage where there is one rate for the country as a whole, or it could be something more similar to what we have in South Africa, where wages are determined by occupation, by sector, and even by geography. So when we talk about minimum wages, we often are talking about both of these types of regimes. So just to give you a little bit of a sense of what that looks like around the world, so in Africa, about 30% of countries have a national minimum wage, a very simple system like in Nigeria where you just have 2 wage rates, whereas many other countries, 61% of countries have sectorally or regionally determined wages. So that would include, obviously, South Africa. So there's no very clear pattern here. Wherever you go in the world, there'll be some countries that do one national minimum wage and countries that go for a sectoral approach. So what we're trying to demonstrate here is that depending on where you set the wage in the distribution, you might get very different effects. So let's think specifically here about job losses. One could apply the same kind of thinking to any number of outcomes, but I think in the South African debate, we're particularly interested in what would a minimum wage mean for employment. What is the change in employment that we see from a change in the wage? Okay? So if something is not very sensitive to price, then we think of it as being reasonably inelastic. But if it's very sensitive to price, then we talk about that as being elastic. So it turns out that the whole debate in South Africa really comes down to if we only knew what that elasticity really looks like, and if we knew what it looked like for different sectors, and if we knew what it looked like for different parts of the wage distribution, we'd be on much firmer ground when we start talking about the national minimum wage. The international evidence suggests that there is typically little or no employment response to modest increases in the minimum wage. So it's important to unpack just what we're saying there. In most parts of the world where minimum wages have been changed, they've been changed in quite small increments. There haven't been radical shifts overnight. And in those cases, typically you don't see big shifts in employment. And another quote there, on balance, the impact of minimum wage regulations tends to be either insignificant or modestly negative. So the international literature suggests that minimum wages don't typically cause massive effects, but the caveat there is that is for small changes. So let's quickly turn to the case of South Africa. I think this is probably known to many of you, but let me cover it briefly. So if we think about workers in South Africa that are below the earnings threshold, so that in other words that are covered by the BCA, how many of them are covered by some sort of minimum wage legislation? About 800,000 are covered by bargaining council agreements. Almost 5 million are covered by sectoral determinations made by the Employment Conditions Commission, on which Johnny sits. Another million workers are covered by agreements that are entered into by trade unions, either at plant level or sectorally, but not within bargaining councils. And then about 2.4 million workers don't appear to be covered by any sort of minimum wage legislation. So the original discussion about a national minimum wage really was centered on those 2.4 million workers. They seem to be missing from any kind of coverage at the moment. And the intention of the sectoral determinations was always to try and cover as many workers as possible. But right now there seem to be 2.4 million that we regard as uncovered. South Africa's system is very complicated. Whereas many other countries like Uganda, Mali, Ghana, Malawi will have one wage schedule, so the equivalent of the Employment Conditions Commission or the government will set a minimum wage, but they'll just set one wage. The ECC sets 124. So that's just the sectoral determinations that we're thinking about there. 124 different wage rates that Johnny and his colleagues apply their minds very carefully to based on lots of perfect evidence, right? So they have a very tough job of really trying, in the absence of strong evidence, of coming up with these 124 wage rates. And then, of course, if you add in the bargaining councils, that number starts to run into the thousands.
You know, wages is a two-sword, a sword with two edges. On the one side, it is something that can stimulate economic growth, and on the other side, it is a cost for a company. So FEDUSA was part with business and the Minister of Finance. We've met 265 foreign investors in New York, London, and Boston. So these are people that have been investing in our country for more than 20 years, from 1994. So when we met with these people, those 265 people, they asked us basically 6 issues came up. And it is also in the priority of what they perceive is things that they don't like. The first one was the political environment. They say that the government unnecessarily create unstable political environment. Number 2, they said the economic growth in this country is too low. Number 4, the fiscal framework, in their view, is quite stable. They were concerned about the state-owned companies, like your South African Airways. Every year they come to the government for another 5 billion. And then number 5 is the labor relations. Now I know there was a discussion this morning. So they only asked us like one thing about the minimum wages. They asked us, where do you think it should be? Should it be at that level or should it be on this level? And then they asked business the same question. Where do you think it should be? And the biggest elephant in the room is the issue of what will the job losses be? But I mean, Ingrid made our work very easy for us. There's minimal job losses. And so I think if a person wants to dig deeper into this phenomenon, then I think we have to go back to our past. And that's the reason why I agree with her. Then she said, this is more a political economy decision. So those were the kinds of things, colleagues, that we have to address today. With wages that has been suppressed for the majority of the people of our country. We can't embrace democracy. We can't embrace a constitutional state. But when it comes to wages, we want to turn our backs on the poor. The poor is going to rise up. They're going to make this country unstable. And from FEDUSA's side, we say, let's introduce a minimum wages that can be phased in over a period of maybe 3 years. So let's start at a certain level, and let's call that A, and let's make a commitment to our people to say, look, let's do this thing over 3 years, and then we move it to B. I think from our side, that will be something that will work, but we need to implement it as soon as possible.
Let's start by having something very clear over here. All decent human beings want all other human beings to have maximal living standards. This is not in debate. So why would anyone be against a minimum wage if its effect is to improve the quality of life of other human beings? The only person who wouldn't want to do that is some mentally ill, perverse, sick person. So there's no debate about wanting to improve other people's quality of life. What then could possibly get somebody to be against a minimum wage if it has all these wonderful effects, raising living standards? One of the things I liked about Ingrid's presentation was her honesty, that if you have a minimal increase, you have a minimal consequence. Well, of course, that comes as no surprise. She did refer to her counterpart at Wits University, who says that if you raise the minimum wage to 6,000, it will have no consequence. Well, this is an interesting thing. Why 6,000? Why are they so cruel? Why do they want people to have only 6,000? These are meant to be decent human beings who care about the poor. Why not 10,000? Why not 100,000? Why not 1 million? Why not 1 trillion rand a month? Wouldn't you like everyone to earn 1 trillion rand a month? Well, the answer is neither Dennis George, nor Ingrid, nor even the people at Wits who live in some kind of weird cloud cuckoo land are recommending that. Why don't they? Because everybody knows that if you raise the price of something, people buy less. Labor is no exception. What matters is whether the consumers are willing to buy more of the thing that costs more, cleaning services or whatever it might be. Not whether the hairdressing is the famous inflexible item where you really can't do much with technology. You can't, at least not for now, have robots doing your hair. It's going to be people. That doesn't matter. If it costs more, people will go to the hairdresser less, even if hairdressers get paid more. And so what we have had, in fact, is the disappearance, complete disappearance of entire types of economic activity. I'm old enough to remember when there was an occupation called copy typing. They no longer exist. There used to be lift drivers. They no longer exist. And so on. I've got a long list here of occupations that have vanished. Why? Because they cost too much. People had the ability simply not to buy those services and to replace them with technology. The fact is, less people are being employed producing the same output. That is an unavoidable consequence of raising the price of anything. Labor is no exception. Why does everyone agree it must be a modest increase? Because everyone agrees that if it's not, it's going to cause unemployment. In other words, what everyone is saying is, let's just have a small impact. Let's just put a few more people out of jobs, rather than a lot. And when we're living in a country in which there are, whatever it is, 2 million, 1.5 million, whatever, formal unionized employees, and 8.5 million unemployed people, it seems to me, if you are a decent, humane human being, the one thing you do not want to do is talk about anything that is going to reduce the likelihood of our most destitute people getting a job.
We tend to compare ourselves with a number of countries, and whereas we are not the same. The research conducted either by ILO, by different universities, does not take into account the disparity in terms of the skill sets. That if you take an ordinary person in Germany, a machine operator in Germany is different from South Africa, because in Germany you find that machine operator either will have a university degree, whereas here, if you are lucky, that person will have standard 1 or standard 3. You compare societies where they offer a social net in terms of number of things to a country that we don't even have a social security net. In this country, there are various forms of setting a wage. We have sectoral determination that the minister determine a number. Whether the spade work was done by Johnny's team, the ECC, I'm saying is one thing. But because there is a particular research that have been done and concluded, and that process was also then canvassed by stakeholders within that specific sector. The second part of the wage setting is the collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is where both parties submit demands. Finally, then they conclude an agreement, and that agreement is then extended by the minister in whatever form, is then become binding to a particular sector. The third aspect then deals with whether it's a planned level, whether it's an area agreement that are concluded for that specific area or sector. I'm saying those are some of the wage settings that we have in the country. In South Africa, we have a national minimum wage based on sectors in whatever form. We have a national minimum wage for engineering. We have a national minimum wage for the retail. We have a national minimum wage for the road freight. And they're not the same because the skill sets, the profit, the cost of employment is not the same across those sectors. The notion that suggests that we need then to have a national minimum wage that cut across the economy is not a feasible one. We can give different examples in the port. So the point that I'm raising is that in this country we have a mixed bag of issues in terms of minimums. You have companies that they pay above the current minimum. You find individuals in a specific sector. If you take the motor industry for an example, if you earn either 20 cents above the minimum and there is a salary increase of 10 cents or 8 cents less than that, you are not going to get that because increases are based on minimums, not on actual earnings. And it then means practically you are not going to move an inch until such time you are on the same level with everybody. And I'm saying those are the complexity of our situation in terms of wage setting. So in conclusion, Justice, the point that we have raised consistently to date is that as business, we are keen and willing to look at a national minimum wage that is based on sectors, a minimum that will take into account different sectors in terms of the diversity, the challenges that are faced with, and will be much better compared to a wall-to-wall national minimum wage that cut across the economy.
We have quite a patchy system right now, so we need to work from where we are. And I was struck when you mentioned the EPWP a moment ago. So think about the guy who's standing at the side of the road, and he gets picked up by, a contractor in a bakkie. Today he's working on a program, he's helping to build a road. So he's covered by the bargaining council agreement for civil engineering, and he's going to earn, 200 Rand, minimum of 200 Rand. Tomorrow somebody picks him up, but now he's going to wave a red flag on the same road, but he's part of EPWP, so he gets 88 Rand or something of that order. And on day 3, he gets picked up by the contractor who's building the structure at the side of the road. So he's still doing construction, but now he's in the construction sector, he's not in civil engineering, and there's no minimum wage. So, I find the current system chaotic. I don't fully understand it. Apparently Justice doesn't either, because he should be paying the sectoral determination wage for wholesale and retail, but apparently nobody in this room gave him that advice during lunch. And so I think we want a simpler system, a more transparent system, and a more fair system.
COSATU, for an example, they've put a figure of 4.5 informed by the VETS research. And their figures is based on 4.5 to 6 whatever number. And one of the arguments that they're advancing is that they're looking at the dependency model. The dependency model basically means if one person supports 4 people, that increases the cost of employment, because if you employ a person justice, you are not employing a person based on number of dependency that individual is having. So you cannot then punish an employer for employing this individual because the dependency ratio either is 2 to 3 or 4 to whatever number.
The whole thing of this job losses has been overplayed because the research shows the evidence. Some people want to talk about emotions. It's their business. Look, from our side, we want to really create not just the minimum wages, but we want to also create a more participatory workforce that's more productive and that's more working together. And that's the reason why we said we want an agreement on the labor relations task team and the minimum wages. And for us, if people say we want to take the people to 4,500, then we won't have a problem to say, let's phase it in over 3 years.
If you want to solve unemployment and you want to solve poverty and you want to raise living standards, there is one and only one way: growth. You have to have a rich country. How do you have a rich country? There is one and only one way, which is that the countries with freer economies are richer and the countries with less free economy are poorer. There are no exceptions. There is only one way to become prosperous, and that is to free your economy. That's what we should all be asking the government to do, to help the poor, to help the destitute South Africans, and there are many millions of destitute South Africans.
I'm not hearing people listen to this research. I'm not hearing it NEDLAC. I'm not hearing it even here. Because effectively the research has been very well done by Ingrid and her team. The most eminent researchers in the country have looked at this thing and said, guys, ladies and gentlemen, if you set this thing at the wrong level, you're going to cause substantial harm. Between 100,000 and 800,000 jobs. So I'm not saying the argument shouldn't be there. We can fight about this all we want. But what we're missing at NEDLAC and we're missing in the public domain is the fact that unless you go into this very easily, you're going to suffer and you're going to have huge consequences, which Ingrid said you can't retract. So if you set it at the 3,500 Rand level and you lose 500,000 jobs, you can't get them back again. And I just want to quote Treasury at the national minimum wage debate, because Elias, myself, Dennis sits at a higher level than us, at the president's level, or as a deputy president. They're still around. But he's like our boss in respect to these negotiations. Treasury said the following: ladies and gentlemen, COSATU government and employers, you have millions and millions of unskilled people in this country that need employment. Understand that debate when you enter this debate. We've lost that with this Wits research, 3,500 bantered around. The research Ingrid just given you said anything above the 1819 level, you're going to lose jobs, and that's dangerous. Go into it carefully. And everyone loses that debate in the emotion. The only thing that's going to pull you out of the poverty hole is skills, and we're losing that. So no one's debating saying Well, it's a multifaceted problem. We should be looking at a proper skills development approach. You create an economy that grows based on skills that you create. You don't create the skills once a manufacturer set up here.